In 1650, the Dutch Republic was the richest nation on earth. Amsterdam served as the financial center of the world. The Dutch guilder functioned as the global reserve currency. Dutch ships managed nearly half of global trade. The Bank of Amsterdam became the strongest financial institution ever established. For a small nation of only around 2 million people, packed into a swampy region of Northern Europe, the Dutch Republic accomplished something never seen before. They created the world's first modern capitalist economy. They introduced central banking, the stock market, and global finance as we recognize it today. They were wealthier per person than any nation before or after them. Yet just 90 years later, by 1740, the Dutch Republic had become a nation of the past. The guilder was losing value. Amsterdam was being overtaken by London. Dutch control of trade had disappeared. By 1780, the Dutch were asking France for a bailout. And by 1795, France invaded and the Dutch Republic came to an end. The nation that laid the foundation of modern finance didn't fade away slowly. It was crushed by mounting debt, endless wars, and the collapse of its reserve currency role in less than 100 years. History books usually explain the Dutch decline by pointing to rising competition from Britain and France. They say the Netherlands was simply too small to stand against larger empires, and that the flow of history moved on without them. That explanation isn't completely wrong, but it's far from the full truth. The real reason the Dutch Republic fell is much simpler and far more dangerous. It went bankrupt, not in a moral sense, but in a very real financial one. The Dutch repeated the same financial errors that Britain would make 2 centuries later, and the very same mistakes the United States is making today. In the next 20 minutes, I'll break down exactly how the Dutch Empire unraveled, how the guilder collapsed from the world's dominant reserve currency into irrelevance, and why the same destructive cycle that wiped out Dutch power in just 90 years is now unfolding in America right before our eyes. Because the fall of the Dutch Republic wasn't accidental or mysterious. It followed a clear and predictable sequence: unchecked debt growth, weakening of the currency, loss of reserve status, and finally total financial breakdown. It's the exact same pattern, and without fail, it always ends in disaster. Let's break down what truly happened and why it's critical to understanding the challenges facing the United States today. By 1650, the Dutch Republic had reached the absolute height of its influence. It wasn't the biggest country, far from it. Across all 7 provinces, the total population was just around 2 million people. To put that in perspective, France had roughly 20 million citizens, Spain about 8 million, and England close to 5 million. The Dutch were heavily outnumbered, roughly 10 to 1, by the nations surrounding them. Yet what the Dutch lacked in size and manpower, they more than made up for with wealth. Astonishing, almost unimaginable riches. In 1650, Amsterdam wasn't just Europe's financial hub, it was the center of global finance. The Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, had earned a reputation as the most powerful and trusted financial institution in the world. It ran the planet's first fractional reserve banking system and issued the guilder, a currency fully backed by gold and silver at a fixed rate. And this wasn't some empty promise, it was real, tangible financial power. At the Bank of Amsterdam, you could literally walk in and exchange your paper guilders for actual gold or silver. This reliability made the guilder the most trusted currency across the globe. International merchants rarely used their own local money. They preferred guilders. A Portuguese trader selling spices to an English buyer would settle the deal in Amsterdam guilders. A Spanish mine owner selling silver to a French manufacturer would also receive payment in guilders. Essentially, the guilder functioned as the world's reserve currency, and the Bank of Amsterdam acted as the central clearinghouse for global trade, collecting fees on every transaction. Meanwhile, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the world's first multinational corporation. Founded in 1602, it was also the first publicly traded company in history. Investors could purchase shares in the VOC through the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the very first stock exchange in the world. By the 1660s, the VOC's value had soared to around 78 million guilders. Adjusted for today's economic scale, that would equal roughly $7.9 trillion, making the VOC more valuable than Apple, Microsoft, and Google combined. The VOC employed over 70,000 people and maintained its own private army of 10,000 soldiers. It operated a fleet of 150 merchant ships, along with 40 warships. Its control stretched over key trade routes across Asia, from Japan to India and Indonesia, and it held exclusive monopolies on valuable spices like nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and cinnamon. These spices, which may seem ordinary today, were actually worth more than gold in the 17th century. The Dutch merchant fleet was the largest in the world. By 1670, the Netherlands owned around 16,000 merchant ships, more than England, France, Spain, and Portugal combined. Dutch vessels carried about 75% of Europe's trade. Need to transport goods? You hired a Dutch ship. Need maritime insurance? Amsterdam was the hub. Financing a trade expedition, Dutch banks provided the capital. Essentially, the entire global commerce system ran through the Netherlands. The wealth generated by this system was staggering. In 1650, Dutch per capita income averaged about 1,300 guilders per year, while English citizens earned roughly 800 and the French around 600. Despite being much smaller in size, the Dutch were twice as wealthy as the French and 60% richer than the English. Urban workers in Amsterdam enjoyed wages that would place them in the middle class elsewhere, and even Dutch peasants lived in conditions superior to those of most European nobles. This incredible wealth was visible in every corner of Amsterdam. Grand Canal houses towered 5 stories high, with imported marble facades and windows made from costly glass. The Dutch indulged in luxuries that were unheard of elsewhere: tulips, exquisite paintings, rare spices, silk, Chinese porcelain, and furniture crafted from tropical hardwoods. The Dutch Golden Age of painting, featuring masters like Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Frans Hals, was directly funded by this prosperity. Every wealthy merchant wanted his portrait painted, and every guild hall was adorned with artistic masterpieces. Yet, true power wasn't in the art, the houses, or even the ships. It was financial. The Dutch had perfected credit. The Bank of Amsterdam operated a fractional reserve system, allowing it to lend far more money than it actually held in deposits. This created enormous liquidity, making capital readily available for investment. Whether you wanted to start a business, build a ship, or fund a trade expedition, Amsterdam had the money to lend. Because the guilder served as the world's reserve currency, the Dutch could borrow at the lowest interest rates globally. The government could issue bonds at 3 to 4%, while France and Spain were paying between 8 and 12%. This advantage meant that the Dutch could fund their military and infrastructure at roughly half the cost of their rivals. By 1650, the Dutch seemed unstoppable. A tiny nation of just 2 million people had risen to become the wealthiest and most powerful financial hub in history. Yet, the system had a critical vulnerability. It relied almost entirely on trade. The Dutch produced relatively little themselves. They were intermediaries, connecting goods and markets across the world. The Dutch acquired goods from Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and sold them in Europe at a profit. They borrowed money from savers and lent it to merchants at higher rates. Their ships transported the goods, and shipping fees added another layer of income. Every guilder the Dutch accumulated came from facilitating trade, not producing it themselves. This strategy made them extraordinarily wealthy, but it also created a fragile system. Any disruption in trade, any closed shipping route, or blocked foreign market could, and eventually did, bring the entire structure to the brink of collapse. The Dutch had secured their independence from Spain in 1648 after 80 grueling years of conflict, known as the 80 Years' War. Financing this long war through loans and taxation had been challenging, but by 1650 they had emerged victorious. Spain recognized Dutch independence, and the Republic was free, prosperous, and strong. At this point, the logical move would have been consolidation, repaying war debts, strengthening institutions, and securing their dominance. Instead, the Dutch made a fatal misstep. They continued to wage wars. Between 1652 and 1784, they engaged in 4 wars with England, fought multiple wars with France, and even battled Sweden. For over a century, the Republic was almost constantly at war. Why? Because trade was everything. England's growing merchant fleet threatened Dutch shipping monopolies, and French ambitions in the Spanish Netherlands endangered Dutch security. Each conflict centered on controlling trade routes, maintaining access to critical markets, and defending maritime dominance. And each war came at an astronomical cost. The first major setback came during the First Anglo-Dutch War, fought from 1652 to 1654. This was a war fought entirely at sea, driven by trade. In 1651, England passed the Navigation Acts, which mandated that all goods imported into England be carried on English ships. This directly challenged Dutch shipping supremacy. The Dutch could not accept this restriction, so war became inevitable. The conflict lasted 2 years and was marked by massive naval battles in the North Sea and the English Channel. The Dutch held their ground, but the war was extremely expensive. Constructing and maintaining warships required huge sums of money, as did replacing lost vessels, paying sailors, and equipping armies. The total cost reached roughly 18 million guilders, a staggering figure considering the Dutch government's annual revenue at the time was only about 12 million guilders. Essentially, the war cost more than an entire year of government income. To fund it, The Dutch borrowed heavily, issuing government bonds and raising taxes. Thankfully, the economy was strong, so the debt was manageable. Still, this marked the first step down a path that would ultimately weaken the Republic. The Second Anglo-Dutch War, from 1665 to 1667, proved even more costly. This time, the conflict was wider in scope. England aimed to seize Dutch colonies in North America and the Caribbean, while the Dutch sought to defend their global trade dominance. The war featured massive naval battles, including the legendary raid on the Medway in 1667, when the Dutch fleet sailed up the Thames, burned English ships, and even towed away the flagship of the Royal Navy, a humiliation that would echo in English history for decades. Yet, victory came at a steep price. The Second Anglo-Dutch War cost around 30 million guilders, more than 2.5 times the Dutch government's annual revenue. To finance the war, the Republic plunged deeper into debt, issuing more bonds, with provinces borrowing from local banks and citizens encouraged to buy government securities. By 1670, the Dutch Republic's public debt had more than doubled, rising from roughly 30 million guilders in 1650 to over 80 million, but the worst crisis was still ahead. And in 1672, the Dutch faced a disaster that nearly destroyed the nation, later known in history as the Disaster Year. France, under King Louis XIV, invaded from the south with an army of 120,000 men, while England attacked from the sea. Sweden and several German states also joined the assault. The Dutch Republic was under attack from 4 major powers simultaneously. Its military faltered, and French forces overran 3 of the 7 provinces. Amsterdam itself was directly threatened. In desperation, the Dutch government opened the dikes, flooding the countryside to create a defensive barrier of water. While this saved Amsterdam, it destroyed farmland, villages, and displaced thousands of people. The economy was devastated. The Dutch fleet engaged in desperate naval battles against the English and French, with enormous human and financial costs. The Franco-Dutch War raged from 1672 to 1678, 6 grueling years of total war. The cost of these conflicts reached an astonishing 120 million guilders. Let that sink in. 120 million guilders. That was 10 times the Dutch government's annual revenue and exceeded the combined total cost of the previous 2 Anglo-Dutch wars. To survive, the Dutch had no choice but to mortgage their future. Taxes were raised to punishing levels: import duties, property taxes, and excise taxes on food and drink. Every possible source of revenue was tapped. But taxation alone couldn't cover the expenses. The government borrowed on an unprecedented scale, issuing bonds under increasingly unfavorable terms. Interest rates began to climb as lenders questioned the Republic's ability to repay. By the end of the wars in 1678, public debt had skyrocketed to over 200 million guilders. To put this in perspective, in 1650 the debt was just 30 million, meaning it had grown by 566% in less than 3 decades. And this was only the beginning. Debt would continue to rise over the next century, eventually reaching catastrophic levels that would contribute to the nation's collapse. Why was this debt so dangerous? The Dutch economy depended entirely on trade. Merchants borrowed money to fund voyages, banks lent against deposits, and the system relied on trust in the guilder. As long as the currency remained backed by gold and silver, and the Bank of Amsterdam was solvent, everything functioned. But the wars were draining gold reserves. To pay for military campaigns, the government increasingly borrowed from the Bank of Amsterdam, which in turn lent out more than it actually held in reserves, a dangerous step toward currency debasement. In 1683, the Bank of Amsterdam did something unprecedented. It lent money directly to the Dutch East India Company, VOC, to keep it afloat. The VOC was struggling financially due to rising competition from English and French trading companies and soaring costs of maintaining forts, armies, and fleets in Asia. This should have been a red flag. When a central bank begins bailing out private corporations, it signals that the financial system is under severe strain. Meanwhile, the Third Anglo-Dutch War, 1672 to 1674, overlapped with the Franco-Dutch War. The costs of these multiple conflicts were already factored into the 120 million guilder figure, but the key point is that the Dutch were now fighting wars on multiple fronts against several enemies and were losing ground. By 1700, public debt had ballooned to 250 million guilders. Half of all government revenue was now consumed by interest payments alone. Half of all taxes collected went solely to servicing existing debt. This is the debt trap. When interest payments consume such a large portion of revenue, a nation can no longer invest in infrastructure, maintain its military, or fund economic growth. Instead, it is forced to service old debt while competitors continue to invest in their futures, leaving the Dutch trapped and vulnerable. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, from 1780 to 1784, was the ultimate catastrophe. By this point, the Dutch were in no shape to fight anyone. The Republic's finances were shattered, the Navy had been neglected for decades due to budget restrictions, and the once mighty merchant fleet had dwindled to a mere shadow of its former glory. When war erupted with England in 1780, it was a complete disaster. The English Navy obliterated Dutch shipping, seized colonies in Asia and the Caribbean, and closed off vital trade routes. The VOC, already teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, finally collapsed. The financial toll of this final conflict was staggering, another 100 million guilders. By 1784, total public debt had soared to 455 million guilders. To give perspective, the Dutch government's annual revenue was roughly 20 million guilders. The debt now stood at 22 times annual revenue. For comparison, the United States today carries a debt around 5 times its annual revenue. The Dutch debt was simply unpayable, and everyone knew it. Meanwhile, the guilder, the world's reserve currency for 150 years, was collapsing. Throughout the 18th century, the Bank of Amsterdam had gradually debased the currency. To fund government wars, the bank lent out far more guilders than it had in gold and silver reserves. This might have worked under normal fractional reserve banking, but the Dutch had pushed it too far. By the 1780s, roughly 30 million guilders were in circulation, but the bank held only about 10 million guilders in gold and silver, dropping the backing ratio from 100% to just 33%. When merchants and foreign governments realized this, panic set in. People rushed to convert their guilders into precious metals, and the bank could not keep up. By 1795, the Bank of Amsterdam had effectively failed. It could no longer redeem guilders for gold or silver. The guilder, once the most trusted currency in the world, became nothing more than paper. Losing reserve currency status was devastating. International trade, which had been conducted in guilders for over a century, shifted to British pounds. Merchants refused to accept guilders, and the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, once the world's most important, was overshadowed by London. Capital fled the Netherlands, banks closed, and the wealth that had made the Republic the richest nation on earth evaporated. At the same time, the Dutch faced an external crisis. In 1795, French revolutionary armies invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch military, underfunded and outdated from decades of budget cuts, could not resist. French forces occupied Amsterdam. The Dutch Republic, which had existed since 1588, was abolished and replaced by the Batavian Republic, a French puppet state. In 1806, Napoleon transformed the Netherlands into the Kingdom of Holland, installing his brother Louis as king. Dutch independence was entirely lost. The final humiliation came in 1814. After Napoleon's defeat, the Dutch regained independence, but the nation was bankrupt. Public debt remained unpayable, and the guilder was worthless. To survive, the newly formed Kingdom of the Netherlands had no choice but to accept a bailout from Britain and other European powers, and the terms were harsh. Dutch trade privileges came to an end, and many of their colonies were either seized or sold. The Dutch were forced to open their markets to British goods. The nation that had pioneered modern capitalism and dominated global trade for 150 years was now reduced to a secondary power, dependent on foreign creditors. The guilder, once the world's reserve currency, was replaced by the British pound. History had repeated itself. The reserve currency shifted from the Dutch to the British, just as it would later shift from Britain to the United States 150 years afterward. So what's the lesson here? The Dutch collapse followed a clear and predictable pattern. First came debt accumulation from continuous wars, fighting England, France, and other powers for over a century, each conflict adding to their financial burden. Second was currency debasement. To fund these wars, the Bank of Amsterdam lent out far more guilders than it held in reserves. Third, loss of reserve currency status. Once merchants and foreign governments realized the debasement, the guilder was abandoned. Fourth, financial collapse. The Bank of Amsterdam failed, capital fled, and the economy imploded. Fifth, external invasion. France took advantage of Dutch weakness and attacked. Sixth, loss of independence. The Dutch became a puppet state. Seventh, forced liquidation of assets. Colonies were sold and humiliating bailouts were accepted to pay debts. This pattern is not just history, it repeats. Britain followed the exact same trajectory 2 centuries later. Massive debt from World War I and World War II, currency debasement after leaving the gold standard, and the eventual loss of reserve currency status to the United States at Bretton Woods in 1944. Britain faced repeated financial crises in 1949, 1967, and 1976, requiring IMF bailout. Since then, the US dollar has been backed by nothing but trust. The Federal Reserve has printed trillions of dollars to fund deficits, and the money supply has expanded by 600% since 2000. The dollar has lost 86% of its purchasing power since 1971. This is currency debasement. This is exactly what the Dutch did with the guilder and what the British did with the pound. Third, loss of reserve currency status is already underway. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 71% in 2000 to 55% in 2026. China, Russia, and the BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems to bypass the dollar, while Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan for oil sales. This mirrors the same process that destroyed the guilder. Fourth, debt servicing costs are skyrocketing. Annual interest payments on US debt now exceed $1 trillion, more than the defense budget. 50 years ago, interest payments were only 1.4% of GDP. Today, they account for roughly 4.8 to 8% of GDP. The Dutch reached a point where 50% of government revenue went to interest before their collapse. America is heading in the same direction. Fifth, trade deficits are structural. The US consistently runs trade deficits of around $800 billion per year, consuming more than it produces and borrowing to cover the gap. The Dutch followed the same model, and when their trade dominance ended, they had nothing left to rely on. History sends a clear warning. The Dutch once believed themselves invincible. They had the reserve currency, the most advanced financial system in the world, and global trade dominance. Yet, within a century, debt, currency debasement, and war destroyed them. Britain followed the same path, collapsing in just 30 years. America is now on the same trajectory. The only unknown is speed. The Dutch collapse shows that reserve currency status is not permanent. Once lost, it never returns. The guilder never recovered, the pound never recovered, and when the dollar eventually loses its reserve status, it will not recover either. Financial power is the only true power. Military strength is meaningless if a nation cannot sustain it. The Dutch had the world's finest navy in 1650, but by 1780, they couldn't afford ships. Britain had the largest empire in 1939, but by 1976, it was pleading with the IMF for aid. America has 800 military bases in 80 countries, but if we cannot service our debt, those bases will close. Not by choice, but out of necessity. The pattern is mechanical: debt accumulation to currency debasement to loss of reserve status to financial collapse, to loss of independence to liquidation of assets. It happened to the Dutch, it happened to the British, and it is happening to America right now. The only difference is the pace. The pressing question is, what will America liquidate? The Dutch sold colonies, the British sold their empire. When debt becomes unpayable in America, what will be sold? Military bases, national parks, strategic assets, or gold reserves. This is not hypothetical. This is the inevitable endpoint of the pattern. If you found this valuable, subscribe. I cover the economic forces that truly shape history. Leave a comment. How long do you think America has before we face our own 1780 moment? Thanks for watching.